Sia, it's now 7:01. I think you should go live on the Facebook.
Lucien.
Okay.
I'm gonna put something up, né?
Okay.
The moment it says live on Facebook, that's when you'll start talking.
Okay.
Okay, I'm preparing it now. You'll see it on your side.
Okay.
No, that's when I'll start to introduce him.
Are you introducing him?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Please check from your side. The moment it says live, né? And then you go through.
Okay. I'm seeing the presentation.
Yeah, it's there for a reason. So the moment you start talking, then it will come to you.
Okay. Are we live yet on Facebook?
I'm just gonna type something on Facebook. You'll see it on your site. Né?
Okay, fine. Good evening, dear comrades, friends, workers in general, members of the Federation SAFTU. We are back again. It's Tuesday, 7 o'clock. We broadcasting live on the Facebook platform of SAFTU, as well as live from the Zoom connection of myself, and which today we have a co-host, Comrade Sia. We are going to do a presentation as we promised, and let me introduce the comrade who's going to take us through the presentation on social security measures that the government have introduced in response to the pandemic of the coronavirus. And the comrade's name is Lucien van Der Walt. He's a South African. He's a writer, a professor of sociology and labor educator. His research engages the anarchist syndicalist and Peter Kropotkin. He's a trade unionist and a working class activist history, particularly in the Southern Africa. And he has been doing studies on neoliberal states restructuring. He currently teaches and researches at Rhodes University in the Eastern Cape, South Africa, and previously worked at the University of Witwatersrand. He is a 2007 PhD on anarchism and syndicalism in South Africa in the early 1900s. Won both the International Prize of the Best PhD dissertation from the Labor History Journal and the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, the prize for Best African PhD thesis. Comrade van der Walt, professor, is also involved in union and worker education, including for Ditzeler Workers Education Institute, and a coordinating and teaching role in the Global Labor University. The former National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa Social Sociology course at the University of Witwatersrand, and the former Workers' Library and Museum, the political schools of South Africa, Unemployed People's Movement, and the current Eastern Cape Short Course Program for Metal Workers Union at the Rhodes University. He is the former head of media for the Anti-Privatization Forum, a coalition of social movements, which was established in Johannesburg in early July 2000 by the activists and organizations involved in two key anti-privatization struggles: the struggles against Equality 2002 and the struggle against the VETS 2001. We are very honored to have you, Comrade here. Good everyone. Good everyone, Comrade here is a background noise.
Okay. Hi, thanks very much for having me here tonight. Yeah, and for the nice introduction. Thanks very much to the comrades of SAFTU for this opportunity. I'm going to talk about a number of issues, and then we'll reserve some time for questions and answers. I'm going to be looking at the state's social development system in the context of the coronavirus crisis for the Workers' Conversation series. I'm going to look at a few main things. The one is that the South African state has committed a significant amount of money for COVID relief, and the emphasis is on the effects of the lockdown that started in late March 2020, and probably the state will end up spending around 800 billion, which includes a 500 billion stimulus package. Now, it's a lot of money. It goes to a lot of different things. Some of it is emergency relief to businesses like soft loans, spending money on rolling out JoJo water tanks, bit more spending on higher education, which has had to move online. Municipalities are going to get extra money, about 20 billion for water supplies, sanitation, and so on. And there are also efforts to expand hospitals and fix up various facilities, because when we move out of lockdown, as we're already doing, infections are going to go up. Lockdown doesn't get rid of infections, it simply slows them so you can buy time. Okay. Now, there's a lot of things that the government has done, but I'm going to focus on the measures that are coming through the social welfare system of grants and social insurance, measures that are meant to cushion the working class in the crisis, in particular in the lockdown. So I'm going to focus on the non-contributory grants, which are things like the child support grant. These are things you don't pay for to get. And I'm going to look at social insurance, which is to say things you do pay into, like unemployment insurance. Now, I'm going to argue that first, although these measures do increase the amount the state is spending, it's fairly limited. It represents not really a major break with the system we have at the present, but more of the same, an expansion of the existing system, and that brings with us the various weaknesses and strengths of the existing system. I'm going to argue the welfare relief being provided is substantial, and though it's unmatched elsewhere on the continent, it's not enough. It's not enough. The measures, the grants are welcome, and they wouldn't have happened unless there was substantial pressure from the working class, especially its elementary organizations, the unions, and it reflects almost 100 years of struggle by the working class to constitute a welfare system, but it's manifestly too small to properly cushion the working class. The state cannot and it will not provide welfare on the scale that can emancipate us. And this is true even in the case partly, it's that the state just doesn't have the funds. And it's a thing we can debate, but fundamentally the state is in heavy debt. It's hammered by economic crises. It's been hammered by quite a lot of looting, and it's under huge pressure even before this crisis. So we can't really wish that away. I mean, there isn't a magical money tree somewhere that the state can just pick money off. But the other thing is that the state isn't really, fundamentally, its day-to-day business isn't really about providing welfare and cushions and comfort and protection for the working class. Fundamentally, the state is quite a top-down structure, very similar to a capitalist corporation. It benefits the people at the top first and foremost. And this limits what it can do, but also limits what it is willing to do. So it's like a car. You can have a nice car and you can wish it would fly, but it's not going to fly. It's a car. It's not what it's designed to do. And the inability of the state to really provide what people need is something which is not a design flaw. It's built into the state. That is the nature of the state. And this has quite significant implications for how we think about it. The second thing is that the state is also operating in a context of neoliberal capitalism. And it's often a term we throw around, but neoliberal capitalism is a very specific way of organizing capitalism. It's not just a policy that some people in government adopt. It's a whole way of structuring capitalism. It's an entire phase of capitalism. Just as we could can speak about earlier phases of capitalism, for example, we could talk about Keynesian capitalism. This is a whole new phase. And this limits what the state is also able to do. So, and I'm arguing when I say it's a phase of capitalism, I'm arguing it's not something you can just change by changing a politician, changing a policy, having some good ideas, having a think tank. It is fundamentally limits what the state can do and what the state is willing to do. All right. In addition, I think the state is really struggling administratively to run the measures it's promised properly. I'm going to unpack what those measures are now, but by 25th of May, and I see it was on the SAFTU Facebook page, only 10 people, not 100 or anything, 10 people had received the 350 Rand social relief grant. 2.6 million people had been approved. 10 got the grant. And this is partly because of corruption. It's partly because of demoralization in the state, but it's partly because of what the state is and what it's fundamentally geared to do and where it puts resources. This doesn't mean you shouldn't make demands of the state. It just means that there are limits on what the state can do. And this shapes how we need to struggle. I would say, for one thing, it means that we're not really in a position to do a general refusal to go back to work. I mean, it's unfortunate, but we've been put between a rock and a hard place. That essentially, state aid is not going to allow the working class to survive in the current context without going back to work. And the state is not going to be able or willing to provide that sort of cushion that would allow us not to go back to work. So I think then politically that means we need to be thinking about a return to work that is based on a fight to enforce, respect basic safety regulations, but to use that return to reactivate union branches, revive union work and safety committees, rebuild relations with communities, including running relief schemes like food schemes, and enabling community-based organization. Because I think what we've seen is that a huge amount of what's been done, for example, most food aid provided under the crisis in South Africa has not been done by the state. It's been done by civil society, which is very uneven, but the state is the biggest, richest organization in the country, and yet ordinary people, neighbors, charities, churches, mosques, NGOs, activists, and so on have actually done more than the state. So I'm saying when we go back, we need to stop relying on the state and we need to get back to basics. We need to use the opportunity to rebuild our power as unions, to educate our people, and begin a long march to build up a working class counterpower and counterculture centered on a united union movement, which can really leverage the power we have, especially at the point of production, for a massive redistribution of wealth and power in society towards a very democratic system. Okay, that's the opening. Okay, I'm going to look at what's happening. There's a lot happening. It's not enough, and that's got implications. But now I'm going to look at what's actually happening. Now, first thing is the South African government is spending a lot of money. It's committed a lot more than any other African country. The 800 billion I spoke about includes, for example, 50 billion for grants. Now, there are limits on what it can spend. We're not the United States. The United States is spending 2.5 trillion US dollars. The United States is spending 2.5 trillion US dollars, which is bigger than the entire economy of the entire African continent combined. What the Americans are able to spend on COVID relief is 7 times bigger than the entire South African economy. We could put it in another way, we're spending 0.1% as much as America, okay, 0.1%. This is the world we live in. We live in a world where New York City has a bigger economy, 4 times bigger than South Africa, and it limits what we can do. Nonetheless, the South African state has spent and is spending more than any other African country, and it's doing this partly, and this is what I'm focusing on tonight, by expanding the existing welfare system. Now, there are real problems in this welfare system, but it is quite a large one. Comparatively, we need to think what we compare to, but if we compare to, say, Kenya or Nigeria or Egypt, for that matter, South America, a lot of Asia, it's quite a big system. We've got a big system because of specifics about South Africa. We're a mid-level, semi-industrial capitalist country. Okay, we're not a poor country like Malawi or Mozambique. If you wanted to do a better comparison of our class structure and our level of capitalist development and its forms, you need to look more at places like Brazil or Mexico. Now, this means that the South African economy can generate enough taxation to fund a lot of welfare in ways that are just not going to be possible for, say, Kenya. It's also got a very large working class. Now, this is very important. Not only do we have a big economy that can pay a lot, but we've had and this is also unusual, an almost complete capitalist revolution. So most people in South Africa are dependent on wages, and most of those people are workers. Now, when you're dependent on wages, you need some sort of welfare to protect you against the loss of income. Once this large working class started to emerge, it fought, and this goes from the 1920s with the old white workers movement, it fought for welfare that could protect it from the market. So it fought for old age pensions. It fought for supplements like child support grants. It fought for things like unemployment insurance. And a very important struggle between the working class from the 1920s onwards to the present has shaped what we got as a welfare system. So in sum, we have a capitalist country, relatively rich in the African context. We have a bigger economy, for example, than the other 11 states in Southern Africa put together. We have a working class of unmatched size and power. And this working class, in particular, the unions have played a role in getting this welfare. But the welfare we got is not a one-way show. It's based on a class struggle. So it was always limited by what the ruling class was willing to concede and what capitalism would enable. Now, there's 2 main wings in this welfare system. The first is around social grants. Now, these grants are paid to you if you qualify. That means in most cases it's needs-based. You don't pay anything in. Until the 90s, the system was based around race in particular, but it also almost completely excluded the homelands. So it started to deracialize in the 70s. It was fundamentally deracialized in 94, and it's grown. In 1994, there were about 4 million people getting grants. By 2017, about 17 million people. Now, these grants are means tested. They usually, not always, but usually means tested. They check how much you earn and how much you have, and then you qualify or don't. They're usually cash grants, and they're unconditional. So rather than give you, in most cases, something like a food voucher, you'll get money, and there won't really be a follow-up on what you do. The grants are non-contributory. It means you don't pay to them, And this was a thing really from the 1920s that unions fought for. They felt that workers shouldn't necessarily have to pay for their own pension. They had contributed on the basis of members of society, and that if you made people pay, it would be unequal. Okay, so workers did get essentially free grants, but the grants are small. And this is very important to note. The grants are small. The system of grants is very big. It covers about a third of the population, but the amount of the grants is small. Millions and millions of people, 17, 18 million people, get really small amounts of money. It's basically the state can't really afford more. It doesn't want to spend more. And people like former President Zuma would have been very happy to get rid of the grants, but you can't really do it. It's too risky. Now, the last thing I want to emphasize here is that the grants, the social grants, are focused on people who can't work. If you're healthy, unemployed, and between 18 and 59, and that's 33 million people, if you're healthy, unemployed, and between 18 and 59, and this is 33 million people, you don't get anything except in disasters. Okay, and the reason for this is very simple. The government didn't want, and this reflects neoliberalism, it didn't want people to be able to live without working for wages. So the idea was you don't give the unemployed money because then they won't come to work. The idea is that the unemployed would get jobs, and jobs would be the basic way to lift the working class up. And the idea is you would get the jobs by making sure that companies invest in South Africa, and you would get the companies to invest by neoliberal measures like deregulation. Okay, now there's four basic types of grants. There's grants for people who've retired or gonna retire. So that's your old age grant, and there's a war veterans grant. I'll talk about the amounts a bit later. Then there are grants for children in need. Again, children are not people who can work. This is people up to the age of 18. There's a child support grant. It goes to the caregiver, but it's basically for the kid. It covers about 12 million people. This can be topped up with a care dependency grant for severely disabled children. And there's a foster care grant. Then there are grants for adults who cannot work, basically for disabled people, and there are different categories around there. And then there's emergency relief, what is called a social relief of distress grant. It's usually food, vouchers, school uniforms. Now, what the government has done with its relief is basically increase the grants for about 6 months and using the existing framework. So there's no real break in policy. What there is a temporary expansion on the grants, which will pretty much run out at the end of October. The child support grants going up from 300 bucks, some 440, then it'll go up to by 300 Rand, then the 300 Rand will become 500 Rand. The old age pension will go up 250 Rand a month. The social relief of distress grant is what we're calling the unemployed grant. Normally, they give some support for people in a disaster like a flood, but because the entire country is now a disaster, the idea is you can give everybody 350 Rand grant per month for 6 months from May. And this will be a cash grant. And in addition to the grants, there will be food parcels, and the idea is 250 a month. Okay, so that's the one side of the state's response. The other side is building on the second wing of the welfare system, which is social insurance. Social insurance are basically like any insurance policy. You pay in, and if you're stuck and you qualify, you get some money out. And there are two main parts in South Africa: social insurance for occupational safety and social insurance for unemployment. So while the social grants are for people who cannot work, the social insurance is for people who do work. The social grants are for people who can't access things through a workplace. The social insurance is for people to access through the workplace. So first, there is compensation for workplace injuries and diseases. It's through an act called COIDA. It used to be called Workman's Comp. Employers pay in, and then if workers are injured or ill at work, they can get compensation, depending if it's short-term or long-term disability. depending if it's curable or not, and depending how severe it is. So in a worst case scenario, you could get a pension if you can't work anymore, or if you die at work, your family could get some sort of pension. Most of this is done through a compensation fund under the Labour Department, but the main part of government has its own one, the army and police have another, the mines have got another, and so on. But this is to protect people for things that happen to them at work, getting stuck in a machine, getting ill, and so on. The other is unemployment grants, and this is unemployment insurance. Basically, employers put in 1% of workers' wages and another 1% themselves into a main fund. And then depending how long you've worked, you can draw down a proportion of your income from the fund, so long as you're still looking for work, and so long as you didn't quit your job or get fired, refuse to accept advice or training, or desert the job. You can also use this to get maternity leave or adopt kids, or if you've got a short-term illness. Okay, now, the state's COVID-19 response also builds on this insurance scheme. First, COVID-19 is now classified as an occupational disease. So if you get the virus in the course of work, by exposure to people that have verified cases, or if you're in a high-risk work environment like frontline medical workers, or through workplace travel, you could claim from the compensation fund, the old Workmen's Comp Fund, but up to 30 days. If you die, your family can get some sort of pension and burial costs. You're not going to get this if you're self-quarantined under the instruction of a medical professional. That's a different thing. And the UIF, meanwhile, has created a special category. Now, normally UIF is dealing with workers who've lost their job because a company's closed, or they've been fired, or something like that. But in this case, because everybody had to lock down, a new system called COVID-19 TERS, that's the Temporary Employer-Employee Relief Scheme, was created. And this meant that employers who can't pay the full salary of workers, and they've had to send the workers home, can apply for this money. The money would normally go through the employer, but smaller companies, less than 10 people, workers can apply directly. You don't get your full salary. It's usually up to a maximum of around 60% and a minimum of around 3.5, which is roughly minimum wage, so long as that's not more than you had before. Now, as you can see, the general thing, the state is spending a lot of money, but it's essentially expanding a fairly limited system, a system which first and foremost is one that cannot get people out of poverty. And it's not a system that can sustain people staying at home indefinitely. Now, when we look at this is partly because there are general limits in the system. For example, the child support grant obviously assists poor children. There's a lot of evidence for this. But at 440 Rand a month, normally, it's not going to give you a decent life. And in many cases, caregivers who are mostly women, who get this grant actually end up in debt because they can't make ends meet. There's a lot of pressure from other members of the family to access the grant, a lot of conflict and so on. The grant system completely ignores those. It's really about people who cannot work. So it means that 33 million people can't get any grant at all. And given that we've got 10 million unemployed before the virus, and it might go up to 16 million, best case is going to go up 2 million, worst case 6 million. Given that this is a long-term problem, there's a huge gap. There are millions of people who will never get another job, who've been fired, but UIF assumes this is a bridging finance. Many people who will never get it because they've never been employed. Now, that's general limits in the system, and those are some examples, but there are limits in the emergency COVID welfare relief as well. First of all, it's only for a limited period. The increases are significant. The child support grant will practically double. Start with 440 Rand, then go up to 740 and eventually 940. The emergency unemployed distress grant is completely new, but these are only for 6 months. So in November, we're going to have a problem. The benefits, for example, for the UIF are also very, very limited period. Now, it also doesn't look, and this is very crucial, as if the state has actually put enough money into the new support. Jeremy Seekings at UCT notes, the state's budgeted 50 billion for grants. That would leave us with around about 7 billion that will go to unemployment grants. That could only cover 3 million people, but we might need to pay for 20 million. So it's probably a 50 million shortfall. The total allocation, this is Gillard Isaac's work, for the special UIF fund is 40 billion. That can only cover a third of the workforce. And it's already using up a huge chunk of the UIF reserves. The food parcel budget for the Eastern Cape is enough to feed 1 in 10 destitute households. 1 in 10. There are more than 260,000 destitute households in the province. The parcel system is 250,000 parcels for the whole country. Essentially, if you divide it equally, Port Elizabeth would only get 4,320 parcels a month. So this is very limited. I just want to spend the time that remains just talking about why it's limited. I think the first thing we need to bear in mind, the limits aren't just because of particular politicians or particular policies. Back in the day, everyone used to blame Thabo Mbeki for neoliberal policies. Now some people blame Ramaphosa. But the fact is those policies don't really shift much. You get them under the National Party. 1979, the National Party, the apartheid party, privatized Sasol, it later privatized ISCO. This continues with the new government. It went under Mandela, it went under Mbeki, it went under Zuma, and it's under Ramaphosa. So this neoliberal framework is actually quite stable. Many of Zuma's corruptions, for example, were done through privatization deals. So we need to look at these as built-in and structural, not as moral problems. We have a miserly minister, or as mistaken choices, that there's a lot of choices and government just bullheadedly sticks to one. The reasons we're stuck here are quite simple. The first is that welfare is based on tax. Tax draws on a surplus in incomes. There's not enough tax if we accept the existing system, which is to say, it's about skimming off a bit on the top, not changing the basic distribution of wealth. The main sources of inequality don't lie in things that grants can fix. They lie in things like low wages, mass unemployment, high prices, high transport costs. And these reflect a society where wealth and power is centralized in a small ruling class based on the state and the private corporations. The next thing is the state isn't really there for the working class. Yes, there's inefficiency. Yes, there's low capacity. I mentioned only 10 out of 2.6 million people got the new grant. We could also say less than 5% of businesses got the new UIF payments so far. Councillors are stealing parcels, but this isn't the whole problem. The South African state as a state is a very uneven state. This is not something which started post-apartheid. This was characteristic of the apartheid state. Historically, the South African capitalist state is a very fractured state. The parts don't work together well. Fights happen between departments, within departments. What you're going to get in one municipality is different to another. One province is different to another. One state corporation is another. And the problem here isn't money. You can throw more money at the state. That money is not going to be used any better because the state cannot use it better because of capacity issues. And it's not designed to do that. And it's got corruption. And we live also, and I want to start to draw this together here, in a neoliberal era of capitalism. I mean, whether we like it or not, we're in a neoliberal world. And this limits what states can do. Maybe if South Africa had its transition in 1964, there would be different options. But we came into a world where everyone had moved to this free market, privatization, flexible labor capitalism. And this limits what the state can do. We can't simply pretend it's not there or pretend we can move to some sort of old system like the old welfare state in the West. The conditions don't exist. And on top of this, we had a massive economic crisis from 2007 that we haven't recovered from. One effect is that the state lost money because a lot of people weren't paying taxes because they lost their jobs or their businesses closed. It spent more money to bail out companies, spent it on things like the World Cup to try to boost the economy, and it spent it on corruption. So what I'm getting at is not only does the state not want to spend more money, but the state is actually not able in many cases to spend more money because it has created such a massive debt around it that it's at a risk of actually going bankrupt. And this is partly what's going on. It's this dynamic between don't want to and can't. And the can't is partly that we're neoliberalism, and it's partly that we're in a debt. Now, I think, and I will wrap up around about here. What this means for working class strategy is that we've got to recognize the state is not really going to put in a lot more money here. In fact, what the state is doing is really moving money around. It's not in many ways spending much more. It's taking money from one thing to another. So it's moved 306 million from bulk water and sanitation projects so it can distribute water tanks. It's cutting, this is the projection, 1.7 billion from the NPA and other prosecution organizations to put into welfare. It's raiding the UIF and the COIDA compensation fund for short-term relief, but it's not clear what will happen in the long term for these funds, especially next year when there are millions more people unemployed. Streams for additional income are drying up. State gets its money from debts, taxes, and charges, but the tax revenue to the state's falling. So the state is spending more, although not enough. It's moving money around in an existing budget, but it's still going to run short of money this time around. So we're thinking could be easily 300 billion loss in tax in 2020, at the same time as it's spending 800 billion more. Printing more money is not going to help. I think both liberals and Marxists understand that this just causes inflation. So there's no magic money tree here. And what that means is we can't position our struggle on demanding more and more from a state that can't and won't provide it. We need to think about some sort of way that we can use the rock and the hard place we're in to rebuild our movements. So I'm saying because we're not in a position to refuse work, state aid is not going to be enough. And because we don't want to lock down millions upon millions of our people in the squalid conditions of the townships, squatter camps, rural areas where the state has completely failed people, and given that the lockdown is already breaking down in many working class areas, we need to fight for return to work based on respecting and enforcing safety regulations, using this to reactivate union branches, revive union work and safety committees, to rebuild relations with communities, for example, by running relief schemes, linking up with civil society, looking at ways that we can start a long march to build up working class counterpower and counterculture. By that I mean a counter-hegemony, and move union politics away from lobbying the National Command Council to struggles that are using our power at the point of production, both for workers, but also for working class communities. This would include struggles around preventing job losses, a moratorium on job losses, struggles where unions link up with communities to demand that schools only reopen when safe, using our structural power to rebuild union community alliances by supporting communities, building up and linking to the energy and activity in civil society that we've seen. So where I'm going, and this is where I'll close, we shouldn't ignore what the state's doing. We should struggle to get as much as possible from the state. But we need to also build a politics at a distance from the state, where we go back to basics, build our power, educate our people, and start to move to a situation where we can have a radical democratization of the economy and society based on self-management, planning from below by the working class, and distribution by need. Okay, so to bring that together, the state has quite a lot of welfare in place as part of a bigger response. Whether the bigger response will help the economy, I don't know, but I can certainly say that the welfare mechanisms put in place, the social grant expansion and the social insurance spending is not going to be enough for the working class. It's being administered badly as well. And I think this exposes the fault lines in our society, both around capitalism and around the state. And we need to think concretely, and it's a conversation on where do we go in this context. Thank you. I'm done. Yeah.
That was a mouthful, Professor Lucien van Der Walt, dear comrade, and thank you very much for a very concise, very clear, very educative presentation, which we received from you today. We can't thank you enough. We can go on and thank you for the excellent work we have done for the working class tonight, and which you continue to do in your life in general. This moment, comrades, we're now going to open to a conversation in the form of whatever questions that we may have received from our Facebook page, as well as any of you who want to intervene, make comment, and ask questions for clarity, and such that we don't just have a top-down, and we have a discussion that will go upward and ensure that everybody who would have participated in tonight's discussion goes away much more empowered than when you come in. So I'm opening up now for those questions and those comments. I've got comrades here on Zoom, and I've got other comrades on. Can we get the questions here from Facebook? And the comrades who are on Zoom, can you raise your hands? Can you enlarge that screen a little bit? It's too small. Yeah, that's good news that this post performing far better than what we have done in SAFTU in a long time on Facebook. Well done, SAFTU. But can we get the questions here? We've got this comrade here only on our screens, and it's looking very good and smiling. But we need the questions, and I need you to raise hands if you want to ask any questions. Okay, there you go. We've got from our Facebook a comrade whose name is Muitwadi Chokwe. She's sent a message earlier and basically saying that these people are playing with us because their conduct, those they talk about, are not working at all. And if they don't pay us, what will happen about the millions that they say is for the people? That's the first question, Comrade Lucien. The second one was from Comrade Moses Brown, who says, what will happen to companies that offer unemployed or who offer employees advance instead of paying them their salaries, and they don't want to open about their annual profit turnovers? That was the second question. Can you engage with those?
I see there's also one came in the Zoom chat as well.
From Sam Tilly. Workers will never have what they need with this boss's government. Forward to a workers' government, forward to socialism. We can agree with you more, Comrade Sam. That's the SAFTU's founding principle, that we recognize the limitations of a capitalist system, and we will continue the struggle. For example, if you look at the statement we will issue, we're saying that the biggest issue that we must begin to struggle about is the reorganization of the entire economy, so that we can do away with the limitations that Professor Lucien van Der Walt was talking about. But those are the three comments, Comrade Lucien. Can you go?
Yeah. Sure. Also note there's one or two came up with Zoom group chat. The one was question to Prof. What is your opinion about the union responses? Have they used the opportunities? And the other was, what are the banks doing in the situation? So let me try to take those. And look, the first one is, I think this has been clear in SAFTU's experience, and I think it's also been clear with the controversy now around Professor Gray, that the state is consulting with various groups, it's ignoring other groups, and fundamentally the power to decide what happens is being hooked up with the, it's left in the hands of the state. So, you know, if you consulted at work, it's not the same as a joint decision. And I think that first comment that Comrade was making is a lot of people have been left out. If you had a real imprint by the masses on the whole strategy, and if you had an open and scientific process, I think you would have different results. Now, I want to be clear, I think the South African state has done a relatively good job. I mean, I'm very glad I'm not in the United States where nobody seems to know what's going on. But at the same time, there are many things that could have been done better if there'd been serious engagement with the people. The second one was with the question the comrade raised about what happens about companies that are maybe manipulating the system, saying we can't pay workers, we need the UIF money, but how do you verify this? How do you verify this when you can't see the company's annual reports? Now, that hopefully is something that the UIF will check. I think for companies to claim UIF monies, there are various procedures. But obviously the scope here is quite clear for companies to abuse the system. And when you bear in mind that the UIF is fundamentally workers' savings, workers are paying salary into this, it does seem there's a lot of scope for something pretty disgusting to happen, which is companies to use the UIF to reduce their wage bill, even if they don't need to do that. So I think the best solution for me on that is for unions to keep up the pressure. If we're going to rely on workplace inspectors and UIF commissioners, we'll be here until the cows come home. Now, the question around union responses, well, I think they very, there was the question about a workers' government and reorganizing the economy and so on. Look, for me, fundamentally, that is my conclusion in the paper, that welfare, it's better to have welfare than no welfare, but we have welfare systems because we live in a capitalist society. So a welfare system is important, it's a gain for the working class, but at the same time, a welfare system is not solving the big problems. The big problem is how is the whole society organized? And it's organized top down. The state and the corporations essentially allow a small political and economic elite to monopolize power and wealth. And until you change that, you're not going to solve a problem where kids are going to bed hungry, and you're not going to solve a situation where people think it's okay to give a kid $440 a month to try to live on. So that needs a fundamental change. The question about union responses, I think that's quite a broad one, and I think it depends on unions. I think I've been encouraged by the fact that some unions who are often quite lethargic have been quite vigilant. At Rhodes University, the university currently known as Rhodes, the Fiducia Union was actually, of all things, very vigilant, and it prevented the university opening for a week until there'd been proper sanitation. So I think there are unions that have not done their job well. I'm not going to name names, but I'm also encouraged by the energy and self-activity the working class through its unions and in communities has shown. So I think that was the question from Comrade Warren. So I'm going to leave that one there. There was, in the meantime, one or two other Zoom comments, but I could leave them for now if we're waiting for more things. There's a comment on Zoom about the instruments of the working class. There's another one about what happens after 6 months. And there's another question about sub-Saharan Africa. But let me just see if there are other Facebook questions and take direction from my chair.
I think you should, I can't see any person raising their hand on Zoom.
Okay.
So I'm going to allow, they are. There's Comrade Elise Guter. And okay, she's asking the question, what will happen after 6 months? And Comrade question, and Comrade Sikhu is very thankful of the presentation. But in the Zoom, the other questions which I want you to engage with, and the first one is coming from Zingaye Brilliant Klaba. He says that I hear that banks were giving some money. What was that money for? The second question is from Warren McGregor. And he says to everyone, question to Prof, what is your opinion about the trade unions which you have responded to? The third question comes from Zanuka Olowaile. He says the political instruments of the working class in terms of trade unions and social movements have been planted post-1994. The political fragmentization is the major problem facing the working class movement and all, oh, see how you interfered with my screen. Okay, thank you. The political fragmentation is the major problem facing the working class movement, and all attempts to rebuild the working class movement is facing a threat from our own self-destruction tendencies. But where do we begin? Then the next question, Elise Kute, we've already raised your question. And then there's a question from Comrade Bastien Skulls, who says, Comrade Lucien, compare to other states governments in the sub-Saharan Africa, how would we evaluate South Africa's response to somebody, okay. How will you, okay, Comrade, something moved up. There are more questions, so I've lost that question. Okay, here it is. How do you evaluate South Africa's responses to the current corona crisis? Then there's a question from Comrade Ayanda Nabe. What happens to the profits made by big business and big capital? They remain untouched, yet their staff is paid by government subsidies. Another question, Comrade Mametres May says, I can't see him, which is true. I'm going to have to enlarge the screen. His hand is up. When we open for the Zoom, you will go, Comrade Mametre. And then there's something from Comrade Pagamili Shubi Majola, who says you speak about unions putting pressure on the point of production, i.e. strike action. During a COVID-19 lockout, it is not possible. Companies have changed unilateral terms and conditions, but we have no recourse. Do you have any other suggestion on how unions can respond to these issues?
Okay.
Those are the questions that are on Zoom.
Okay. I would
want to answer these questions or hands that are up.
Okay. Let me try to deal with what we've got there. I can see some of them in the Zoom chat. The thing about how unions have responded from Warren, I think I've mostly dealt with that. I think it's been uneven. Some unions have failed. I'm not going to name names, but I think there's also been some inspiring examples, even from unions that are traditionally quite moderate. And I'm giving an example of the union at one of the unions at Rhodes and Tewu, which basically prevented the university opening for a week until we had safety. So I think the union things there. The thing about banks, question from Mzingai, I think that takes me a bit far afield. There are things that would need another discussion. There are things where the government and banks are trying to provide various loans to cushion people. But I think that's another discussion. There is the thing from Bastian about sub-Saharan Africa. Look, I think generally South Africa's done quite well. Like I say, it's limited, but I think it's done quite well. And I think this goes down to the fact that partly South Africa is a much richer country than most African countries. It's got a much more sophisticated state, a much more entrenched ruling class of its own. And I think there's also the pressure from the large working class. So I think we've done relatively well. I was engaging a comrade of mine in Kenya the other day, and she said, in most of Kenya, there isn't even a lockdown. Because there's no real support for the poor are refusing to lock down. So all government can do is enforce a curfew. If you look at, say, Zimbabwe, 2-3 weeks ago, it had two testing facilities in the whole country, and those were in the two big cities, Harare and Bulawayo. So I think in terms of how many tests, how many screenings we've done, how much going out in welfare, it's good. I'm just saying in the context of the inequality, poverty, economic crisis we've got, it's not enough. So the question is, how do we build on what's good that we've won, but go to something bigger, which we have to have, so that we're not always sitting on the same spot trying to survive. Now that brings me to the questions that were raised. I think one's by Ayanda about what's happening to the profits of big capital. You see, Ayanda, I think this is part of the problem of where we are with the neoliberal situation, because we've essentially got quite an open economy, and it's quite easy to move money in and out the country. So our government and many other governments, I'm not going to say our government, I'm going to say this state's not our government as the working class, the government, is worried about what to do about big capital, because it can move its money fairly easily. It can move its money fairly easily. And one of the things that was done in South Africa in the 90s was essentially allowing a lot of our big firms to decamp out the country. So what's now BHP Billiton used to be Glencore, SAB is now a global company, and so on. So the scope for that is limited. We need to think quite carefully how we would get onto that. And that comes down to a question of power. And that's why I'm saying we've got to look at the balance of forces. And the first thing we've got to do is rebuild our movements and make sure they're strong so we can win pressure. When able to put in pressure, and that brings me to the question, I think it was Pakamile. Yeah, look, when I'm talking about putting pressure at the point of production, I don't necessarily just mean strike action. I mean, I think it could be even more modest. I mean, we've got to see how the balance of forces is at the time. We've got to see how the employers are responding, and we've got to see how prepared our unions are. I think we could think creatively. For example, I've seen there have been these demonstrations by frontline workers. There have been protests in some of the Cape Flats areas. Okay, some of them have just been plain street protests, but there have been noise-based protests. We could think creatively. I mean, I think the struggle at the point of production doesn't only have to be the strike. I think a few big strikes would be a good thing, but I think we have to get the basics in order. So I think we need to think creatively, and maybe health and safety committees is one. We could do worker-led inspections of workplaces. We could send around worker inspectors. We could use the pressure of the media on some employers. But the point is, at production, we're organized and we've got a structure, whereas often in the neighborhoods, we're atomized into individual families without a structure that's permanent. As we know, many protests in South Africa in communities flare up and they're gone. They're mushroom protests, popcorn protests. It's not saying they're not significant, but where we have permanent mass organizations like unions at workplaces, we need to think about how we can use those. Now that brings me to Zonakolo's question about the political instruments and state of the working class. Look, I'm not a pessimist, but I think we are on the back foot. The working class is retreating in South Africa. We're not defeated, but we've been retreating for a long time. We've got big problems in-house in our structures. We have a very divided working class movement. We've got things like health and safety committees, as an example, have almost completely collapsed. Union education is not in a good state. So for me, this is why I use the phrases back to basics, that we need to rebuild the basic things and use this opportunity to reactivate them. And this is why I talk about the long march. We're not where we were in 94 or even in 2000. We need to think very carefully how we use this to get the basics right. We're not in a position here where we're about to overthrow capitalism by any means. The question then is, how do we link this reactivation of the unions now to a bigger process of building and accumulating systematically the power, the experience, the consciousness that will allow a fundamental, bottom-up, radically democratic reorganization of society. Because I want to be quite clear, I think increasing the power of the state is not a reorganization of society. It's a musical chairs at the top. Eskom is a state-run company. It's the fourth biggest company by revenue in Africa. It's bigger than Anglo-American. Look at it. It's no better than any other company. To me, there's no significant difference. I mean, Comrade Varvey mentioned I had a limited tangential role in the Anti-Privatization Forum. Well, the Anti-Privatization Forum was primarily fighting government bodies. It wasn't fighting actual privatization. It was fighting Eskom. It was fighting municipal councillors. Many of the community struggles we see are not against capitalism directly. They're against the state. So I think we've got to be thinking about a reorganization and a rebuilding of the working class that builds at a distance from the state. The last question I saw there was by Comrade Rihard, I know there's some others. He's talking about the education sector. Yeah, I think what's happening in the school sector is very important. You know, when you see efforts by SAFTU to work with, say, COSAS, when you see even fairly traditionally conservative unions like Napotsa or the Suid-Afrikaanse Onderwysunie coming out, I think this education thing, the school thing, is going to be a key place where unions can play a major role and where unions can leverage a connection to the working class in the communities. Yeah, so I see you moving your icon. Must I respond to Comrade Carl there quickly or not? Komvabi, you muted, Com.
Comrades in the Zoom for too long. The problem is that I can't see them, Comrade. The person who can see them is my host, Comrade Sia, and on the other side. But I can't see anybody raising a hand or not raising a hand. I see that there's another question that I think you must note from Comrade Abi Adams, and who's asking, what about the COSATU's call to amend pensions provident fund rules in order for members to dip into their retirement savings during this period?
Oh,
of,
yeah.
And I think that's a very important question. And the others, there's another question that I saw from a leader of the Assembly of the Unemployed, and Comrade Dimabe, was saying, assuming that the government will never ever consider a socialist economy. In the circumstances, what is wrong with organized labor investing strategically in the very capitalist system, particularly in goods services, which are in most consumed by the working class, particularly the low earning and the unemployed? And it goes further to say, investing in, amongst other strategic companies like Checkers, Ackerman, PEP, assuming that the government capitalism will never be from Comrade Gosana Sibuyi, who says, how could states' response to COVID-19 enhance the organization of the state? And then, Mamet Resme, you say your hand is up. Once these questions are answered, we're going to come back to Zoom and close with the comments from the Zoom. But we're now 4 minutes past 8. We've made a commitment to all of you comrades that we're going to be strict on time, strictly between 7 and 8. We know that workers do not have enough data to stay forever and ever on these discussions. So, Comrade Prof, be sensitive to that in your last response, especially to those questions I've just read, and then go to Zoom.
Okay, I'll do my best to do that quickly. Look, I think it's very important to when we think about unions, to ask what is the aim of unions in the end of the day. At one level, it is an elementary organization to defend the working class, but in organizing, we also create the union activity creates the space to unleash our imaginations, to think critically about what can work and what can't work. So I think the whole COVID-19 crisis raises fundamental questions about how society works. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of those discussions. Now, this brings me to the issue of COSATU and the retirement fundings. Look, I don't really, I don't have a problem fundamentally with the COSATU proposal that we must maybe allow workers to access some of their retirement funds. But, you know, I think that's purely at a level of people surviving. But my worry is we letting the bosses and the state off the hook there a bit. I don't think I'm contradicting myself in that. I think it's just like you will fight an employer to get as much wages as possible. We should fight the state to get as much welfare as possible. In the same way, my preference would be that we try to force more money out the state before workers start to access the retirement funds. But if it's a question of putting bread on the table, I don't have a problem with that. Let me go to the comrade from the Assembly of the Unemployed, if I'm correct, that's Daddy Mabe. Thank you for raising that question about unions investing. Look, unions actually have a lot of money tied up in private companies. SAFM, ETV, Golden Arrow buses, Dove's funeral parlors, Netcare hospitals. In my view, and I've written about this elsewhere, why can't unions redirect a lot of that money into maybe not investing in the capitalist corporations like Ackermans and so on, but into building up around them a media, a proper media, and building up around them cooperatives. Now, I don't think cooperatives will change capitalism, but to me, it's a better thing to put money into than to put it into a capitalist company. The problem is if unions invest in a capitalist company, what happens when the workers in that company go on strike? When they outsourced at WITS, the NUM, the miners' union of their time, had shares in FedEx, which took some of the outsourcing contracts from their sister union, Nahawu. So I think you're correct. Unions should redirect their funds. We should build alternative institutions, and we should use some of the union money to do that. But I would be more in favor of using it to build media and alternative media, to build neighborhood centers, and to set up things like cooperatives. So that's where I'd go on that. There's just a final thing here. Why make demands at all? Why not just step back? I think because fundamentally change requires a powerful, organized working class movement that can take over society. For me, that's fundamentally what it's about. A movement from below. It does not involve political parties. It doesn't involve parliament. It doesn't involve the National Command Council. It does not involve the government departments. It involves essentially a confrontation between the working class, unified, especially with unions, which I think are absolutely crucial, and capital and the state. Now, winning small demands is important to that process because in the process of struggle, we build our organizations, we build our consciousness, and we build our confidence. And frankly, as Rudolf Rocker said in Anarcho-Syndicalism, a classic book from 1938, if a worker isn't willing to fight for a slice of bread, she is also not going to be willing to fight for socialism. So we do need to have immediate demands, but the immediate demands should be based around building an autonomous working class run society that can replace the existing society rather than hoping the state will become some sort of socialist big daddy, rather than putting our eggs in the state basket. We've done that since 1994. It's not working. We need to rather build at a distance from the state. We need to build autonomy. We need to build things like cooperatives and media. And to wrap that up, I spoke earlier about counterpower. I mean, building a working class power outside and against the institutions of the ruling class. Using contradictions, using struggle. And I spoke about counterculture. I mean, counter-hegemony. I mean, getting a mass education among our people around socialism. For those of us who are a little bit older, and I'm not the oldest here by any means, the amount of political retreat in the consciousness of the class is just incredible. The capitalist colonization of consciousness, the way politicians have captured the political space. I was so irritated the other day to read a certain political party calling for a permanent lockdown. Those guys are part of the ruling class. Those politicians in parliament earn over $1 million a year, get $500,000 of benefits. They're not affected by lockdown. They're parking off in the suburbs. What they do in a week, I don't know. Do we notice that they're not there? I haven't noticed any difference that parliament's closed. Fundamentally, we need to be outside of that and in conflict with that. So that's where I'll wrap it up. Welfare is great. We should push for more, but we need to push beyond that. Thank you, comrades.
I'll take the two comrades that are itching and that we must close with. And I hope that I'm not fair if there were more people raising their hands. Comrade Mabekres Bay and Comrade John Apolles. That's what I saw as comrades indicating that they want to ask some questions or make some comments. Comrade Bay.
Thank you, Comrade Chairperson. Thank you, Comrade Lucien. Firstly, let me start with my assessment of the trade union response. Reality is that it has been quite dismal, and I do think that includes ourselves in SAFTU. And I think what is important here is that at least as SAFTU, we are beginning that conversation about how to better respond and respond more effectively. This lockdown was imposed on and at the expense of the working class. The bailout has been the bailout of millionaires and not millions of working class people, as you have said. And I do think that requires a response from the labor movement and from the working class. One of the critical, one of the most fundamental weakness has been lack of cohesion, but I think that also flows from lack of leadership, particularly of the organized battalions of the working class. As you have said, we have seen a spontaneous outburst of working class solidarity across the country. The question is, what SAFTU is doing to bring all of that into a coherent movement that can unite the working class, not just in terms of solidarity around immediate issues of survival, but also into a movement that can develop a political strategy to confront both, the militarization of society, which we know for the ruling class is in anticipation of the major class battles that lies ahead, but most importantly, as well as to contain the working class in the storms that are beginning to build up in workplace and so on. Now, the question to you, Prof, is what is it that you think concretely SAFTU should be putting forward in this situation to ensure that we galvanize this spontaneous outburst of solidarity into an organized movement of the working class for resistance? And I think I would have also been interested in the elaboration in this situation of, I know that you are a revolutionary syndicalist, as to what will be your strategy concretely, because obviously you know that we have ours as a SAFTU, but what would be a revolutionary syndicalist strategy for how to build what you call a counterpower with a view to bring about a socialist society in a concrete situation of a class struggle in South Africa in a context of the ANC government that is not only failing the working class, but increasingly brutalizing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Sibeye. Can we take quickly Comrade John Apolis?
Thanks, Comrade Vavi. I'm just going to be very short because of the time problem. I think, first of all, there is a number of contradictions in Comrade Lucien's position, but that's for another day. First of all, his treatment of the South African state is quite abstract, but leave that also. My one question is this: why would he say we must engage with the state and put demands on the state when his position is one of the state will never move, the state cannot spend any more money, the state is bankrupt? So why would you want to put demands on the state? I agree, we must put demands on the state, we must force and fight for advancements in terms of pushing the state through that process, building the working class power and confidence and all of that, and win demands that can protect the working class. Now, if he has a position that says the state will never shift, will never spend anymore because it's bankrupt, it's limited, it's new liberal, so why would we want to embark on that strategy of his, which I agree with, in terms of putting demands on the state and building working class power as a way of doing that, and in that way present an alternative to society. Yeah, but all the other ones we can deal with at another time.
I saw that the Comrade Desai want to another question. Rihad, you asked a question in writing, but you still want to hear your voice. Why?
I think what Comrade Lucien is outlining is that we're heading for a very deep crisis. We know the amount of jobs that will be lost. We know the loss of revenue and so on. A lot of this has been outlined by him. We entered into the virus in a deep crisis, and I feel that this is something that's tipping us over the edge now. the crisis will deepen and deepen, the contradictions will sharpen. And if that is the case, and Lucien's predictions about the state's inability to meet the needs, which will be coming hard and fast at it from our quarters and others, then the question of a long march is brought into question, because I think we will see some deeply intense struggles. They're already hotting up in a major way in the hospitals. We're seeing what's happening in the schools. If we can get the school thing right, in a way, in many ways, this is the beginnings of the portal to the new South Africa that we as socialists want to see. Better schools, smaller classrooms, sanitation, ablution, so on, smaller classes. And I think that's the beginnings. This is the transformative struggles that we are faced with head on. And I would agree with Sabay. The unions have been missing. It's been 2 months in lockdown. This is the first public event that we've had from the militant organized sections of the working class. And I salute you for doing this. It's a bit late, but we must now continue and do more and more. Thank you, Comrade Vavi.
Thank you, Comrade
How
Desai.
much time do I have? Because that's a lot of stuff there.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes. This
Well,
is not meant to exhaust all political
okay,
ideas.
because we won't be able to get through all of that. And I just want to emphasize, I appreciate the comments, incisive comments by Comrade John, Comrade Sabay, and Comrade Rihad. To put it quickly, the problem we got is the crisis is here, but we're not ready. Okay, so we're not in a position where the working class is able to seize power or fundamentally push. We should push as hard as we can, and in that struggle try to build up the forces that will allow us to push more. But the crisis has arrived and we're not ready. So in that thing, I think we need to mount militant struggles, but we need to build those carefully, and we need to not build our thing on what we hope will be, but on the actual state of the actual working class, which is highly divided unions. Well, let's take Hardy's point, unions that in many cases might have slept through the last 2 months. So my idea of a long march, it doesn't have to be that long. It can get compressed, but we've got to get the basics right first. Now, Sabay, in terms of Mametwe, in terms of a syndicalist thing, my view is basically this. We need to democratize the unions and reform them in that way. We need to unlock the money that's in the investment companies and pour that into mass organizing campaigns. We need to use that to build a union footprint back into the communities. We can't keep doing this on the side where we have a resolution for this front or that front and then nothing happens. We need to actually unlock that money and redirect it. And that's a political question, and it requires a reform of many trade unions. We need to find ways that different unions can unify around common platforms, if necessary using a sort of united front. But fundamentally, we need to aim at building a united front of the working class in its various formations. And this means in building, I don't just mean getting numbers, I don't just mean having meetings, I mean reviving the culture of radical political education we had in the 80s. I'm talking about where necessary, looking back at things like SDUs, and I'm talking about rebuilding things like cooperatives and worker community alliances. So for me, it is not a political party that will be the instrument that will unify the different sections of the working class. It will rather be a front of the different organizations of the working class within which different political forces will be active. And it is that front of bottom-up working class organizations, well, hopefully many of them can transform into that or be replaced by that. From that, we can prefigure a new society. Right now, the people that are actually ready to take the leap around the world is not the left, it's the right. You know, if you look at who tore down NAFTA, it's not the Zapatistas, actually, it's Donald Trump. So in the situation, the left is in a bad state and the working class is in a big retreat. And I think we got to use that basic realist understanding to work at where we go from here. And that is to build from below for a counterpower and counterculture, and recognize that even if we have huge battles now, they're not necessarily going to end in some sort of revolution at all. We will have to take it day by day and see where we go. Thanks, comrade.
Can we also thank you, comrades, on Facebook, on Zoom, who have participated. We've already thanked the professor who came and made such an excellent presentation, which I guess will engage with it not only here in the social media platforms, but also in our organizational structures. Comrade Sibey is correct. SAFTU is starting a discussion about what we do as the working class in the midst of the crisis, the biggest, at least for us, the younger generation. May I inform you that again, you can come back. We're having a discussion about whether we are ready to go back to our schools, whether the working class in general is ready to go back to the schools. The government have asked all educators to go back to class and prepare for the grade 7s and grade 12 come the 1st of June. Are we ready? We're going to have a very interesting discussion between a panelist of 3 comrades. The first one being Professor Mary Metcalf, a known educationalist in South Africa. A second one, the General Secretary of the Equal Education, Comrade Noncedo Matubetube. And the third one from the National Association of School Governing Bodies, Matakanye. And they will discuss education in the context of COVID-19. Please come back, continue the tradition of a lively discussion in the SAFTU Workers' Conversation on Thursday. Please come back, tune in, and let's continue the discussion. Let's continue the tradition. Thank you very much to everybody for tuning in.
I see there's a request for a copy of the paper. I'm happy to share the notes. I see from Comrade Sibey. Can you share the notes on the point? Yeah, I would be happy to provide I just need to edit it a bit. I'm happy to provide the document and so it can be uploaded or shared. Okay.
Viva.
Sorry.
Viva.
Viva. Manda.
Manda. South Africa.
Manda.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.